In Bangladesh, thousands turned out to remember the 1,100 people who died in a building collapse more than 3 weeks ago. Almost all those killed were garment workers. Soldiers, police, and firefighters stood solemnly as relatives of the dead gathered near the rubble of the 8-story building in Dhaka. They prayed for the souls of those who lost their lives and asked for blessings for the injured. The collapse of the Rana Plaza, the worst garment factory disaster in history, has thrown a spotlight on the working conditions in the huge Bangladeshi clothing industry. The tragedy seems to be forcing change. The Bangladeshi government is loosening its laws to allow unionization. It's also promised to improve workplace safety. And perhaps more importantly, many of the world's clothing retailers are signing on to a legally binding plan to improve fire and building safety at their suppliers' factories. To explain the significance of this retailers' pact, we have Quan with us on Skype. Quan is Associate Chair at the University of California Center for Labor Research and Education. She's also a former garment worker and union executive. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Ms. Quan, are you optimistic about this new plan?
Well, I am, because the new plan has a lot more than the previous practices had. This new plan calls for legally binding changes in the construction and the labor standards in Bangladesh. And hopefully this will bring about some dramatic change to the working conditions.
Well, how is it legally binding? Are there certain penalties and punishments in place, and what makes it different from previous promises from global retailers to monitor factory conditions?
Right. Right now, global retailers have adopted voluntary codes of conduct. And these are standards that they've adopted, like they'll pay a minimum wage, or they'll make sure that overtime pay is paid when workers work overtime, and so on. And so they're kind of general, and they haven't stopped the tragedies that have occurred, like in Bangladesh. And so what labor advocates have been talking about is something that has more teeth in it, something that a worker can actually take and say, there's something legally binding here. If the company is not following it, I can actually bring legal action against the company. And the standards that are being talked about are much stronger than the previous standards, especially with regard to health and safety.
Okay, so there's some recourse for the workers now. The promises to reform are being led by European companies. American retailers, though, have been reluctant to sign up, although Gap did say it would do so earlier this week. Why the reluctance from American companies?
Well, the Gap and Walmart, I think, have some concern about the legality of the new contract. They don't want to be held to a legally binding contract. And, you know, I think that what's been proven is without that, things like the building collapse and the tragic fires will continue to happen. So much more dramatic steps and much more binding enforcement is needed if we're really going to correct the situation.
Let me just play devil's advocate for a moment, because the retailers, of course, are in the business of making money. And consumers, quite frankly, a lot of them don't want to have to pay a lot for clothes. So how do you resolve this? I mean, the companies, do they have a legitimate stake here in saying, hey, look, we're employing people. You can't hold us to austere safety measures. That might put us out of business.
I mean, consumers have proven over the years that they do care about the way that their food is produced, the way that their garments are produced. Many people in the 1990s agreed that Gap and Kathy Lee Gifford and Nike should adopt labor standards for the conditions under which their clothing is produced. So consumers have played an important role in labor rights in the past few years. But I think, as we saw in Bangladesh, it's just not enough at this point. And so I think it's important to understand that it's time to take a step forward and put teeth in the standards.
All right. Thank you, Katie, for your perspective.
Thank you.
Katie Quan is Associate Chair at UC Berkeley's Labor Center. You can learn more about her on our experts page.
Now on U.S. airwaves, a global channel of uncompromising stories. World news, documentaries, entertainment, and culture. Link TV, connecting you to the world. For more information, visit linktv.org.